tribes life, and then also she's been a guest on many podcasts, and Julie's a fellow of the Yaddo Corporation, the McDowell Colony, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. She's winner of the Literary Death Match, the international competitive reading series founded by Adrian Zuniga. She bought a sword, according to her bio. Lives with her family in Hudson Valley. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Julie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody. And I hope you can all hear. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm very pleased to share with you my book, Eva and Eve. This is the cover. This is my reading copy, which is a little tattered, but so I thought I would start with a short PowerPoint presentation that would introduce everybody to the world of Vienna's Jews before the war. It was a very particular community. The more I researched, kind of the more amazed I was. It was a very vibrant culture where for quite some time, Jews felt very safe. They were very engaged with the culture at every level. They were musicians, artists, writers. Perhaps some people here have heard of Stefan Zweig, who was a best-selling author at the time. Of course, Sigmund Freud was working there, and it was just a very beautiful and complete culture that ended very, very abruptly on March 11th, 1938. My mother was born in 1928, and at the time of the Anschluss, as it's called, which was the annexation, when the Nazis arrived in March 1938, she was about 9.5. And so this really was the turning point in her childhood, which previously had been, I think, a very sheltered and protected childhood. So what I'll do now is I'm going to share screen, and hopefully all that will go well. Hold on, there's always technology. Okay, this is not working as I would like. Okay. Hold on, and here we go. So I hope now you can all see the screen. So here is just the hardcovers on the left, and there'll be a paperback coming out in May of next year. And the photograph on the paperback is of my mother as a young woman. My father took it when they were a young couple. I've always loved this photo. And I'm going to, this is the, on the left is something called a poesy album. This discovery of my mother's poesy album is what really began my research project. It happened shortly after my mother died in 2006. And I thought I would read to you just a very short passage from the book where I make this discovery, because this really sort of began everything. In the back of the drawer where my mother kept her perfume-scented silk slips and nightgowns, I found a small book bound in coffee-colored linen. Pasted in the center was a lithograph of 2 kittens with red and pink ribboned collars. The word poesie was stamped on the linen in faded gold ink. Inside were handwritten notes, all in German, addressed to Eva, or sometimes Evie, with dates from November 28th, 1938 to March 24th, 1940, the day before my mother and her parents left Vienna for the United States. My father came into the room and I held out the book. "Have you ever seen this? Do you know what it is?" He said he'd never seen it before, not once, during all the decades of their marriage. My sister-in-law had studied German and was able to decipher some of the old-fashioned script, messages of love and farewell from childhood friends and older relatives sometimes accompanied by famous verses from the poet Goethe. One page was filled with girlish drawings of hearts and colorful stickers of children in traditional Austrian costume. Do not forget me, your loving friend, Sylvie. On one spread from 1939, a girl named Renata had copied the characters from Disney's Three Little Pigs from a movie advertisement in colored pencil. Across the spread, she'd lettered the line, "Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?" There was indeed a terrifying big bad wolf in Vienna by January 12th of 1939. His name was Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of Hitler's final solution, which would nearly obliterate European Jewry by the time the Nazis surrendered in 1945. My father looked over my shoulder, voicing what I suspected. Some, perhaps most of the people who had signed this keepsake book, those who did not get out of Vienna by October of 1941, when the German government forbade emigration, must have perished. By the time my mother left with her parents, it had been almost too late. Who were all these people? Aunts and uncles, family friends, teachers, other girls who may not have reached adulthood. As I turned the fragile pages, I was saddened but not surprised that my mother had never shared this most private journal with her family. Eva had escaped and lived. She had become Eve. She'd found love, married, worked, created a family. She had become an American. But how had her family gotten out? And had she felt guilt for surviving? So once I discovered this book, and I didn't know at the time that there were archives full of these little keepsake books that were wildly popular with young girls at this time. But eventually I did make contact with the Leo Baeck Institute in New York and discovered that in fact that archive has many of these books, and they all look quite a bit like this one. And so at that point, I started my research project. The image on the left is an important theme in the book, has to do with stories that my mother would tell me about how her family had gotten out. My grandfather, whose name was Julius Singer, worked for a company called Adolf Eisenman and Son. On the left, you can see an example of an invoice. In fact, it's possible that some of that writing in there is my grandfather's writing. The invoice is from 1930. And they made paper goods for the pharmaceutical industry, which doesn't sound very glamorous, except that my mother always would say that her father's life was saved because of an item that this company manufactured, which was used to dose powdered medicine in the days before pills came into use. Even after pills were becoming more popular, this item was still being made and still very much used. And so what happened is that at one point, as my mother would tell the story, her father was arrested, put on a train that was supposedly going to Dachau, but then the factory workers who were not Jewish protested that they needed Mr. Singer there to help them run the factory. Apparently, according to my mother's story, my grandmother was brought down to the police station. They went to the train station. They pulled my grandfather off the train and sent him home to run the factory, which by that point he no longer owned because it had been Aryanized. This was one of many stories that seemed really quite beyond belief to me as a child, but I was able to document that. But anyway, in this invoice on the upper left, you can see the building where my mother grew up. It's on number 22 Weimarer Strasse, which if any of you have been to Vienna, it's a mostly residential area. In the back courtyard is a factory, which you see here in this engraving, but I've been there myself and I can tell you that the factory is quite a bit smaller. There are no smokestacks. So like many advertisements, there was some exaggeration going on. The item that my mother would describe for me. She always said it looked like a paper fan. I had no idea what she was talking about when I was growing up. She didn't have an example of it, but clearly she remembered it very well. Part of the story that I tell in my book is how I came to find this paper fan again and came upon, with some research, these advertisements. The item was called a Pulverkapseln in German. Pardon me for my bad pronunciation. And you can see it on the left. This is from a pharmaceutical catalog at the time. And then on the right, you can see how it was used, that the pharmacist held it and then scooped the powder into the empty channels. And this item was patented about 1905 and was very, very successful. This is my photograph of a new one, because this item, in fact, is still being made today and by a small company produced on a machine that I believe is the same machine, and it's used for homeopathic medicine. And then I'd love to share a few photographs that give you an idea of what Vienna was like before the war. People, of course, loved going to the theater and the opera, and they also loved going to costume balls, which were apparently wildly popular. That is my grandmother on the left, dressed in a costume that she must have made herself. I looked under a loop, and those are real flowers, not silk flowers. And then on the lower right, my grandmother is second from the right, dressed up perhaps, I think, as Mozart, hard to tell, with two of her brothers and some women. I don't know who they are, but might have been my uncle's, my great uncle's wives. Another theme in the book has to do with one of the great popular pursuits in Austria, which was mountain climbing. It was a beautiful area around Vienna and very accessible. My grandfather was a very avid climber. You see him in the photo on the left. He's perched on that ladder with dark hair and the dark mustache, carrying his rucksack. And the gentleman who's above him is his best friend, and I believe the young woman is his daughter, Adela. And this photograph was so helpful to me because it was actually dated and the location was included. So it was in May of 1928. My grandmother would have been home, very pregnant with my mother at the time. But the location is a place called the Hohewand, which is a mountainous area just outside of Vienna. And this would have perhaps been a weekend climbing place. On the lower right, you see I found the membership card for the Jewish Mountain Climbing Club. About 1922, the regular Austrian climbing club evicted all of its Jewish members. And so the Jewish mountain climbers formed their own club. And what was always so poignant to me about this document is you can see that it's dated 1938. So this was the brand new membership card for the year 1938. And so it makes it clear to me that the family had no idea of what was coming just 2 months later. In fact, they had every reason to think that they were going to be able to continue with all the things that they enjoyed, including climbing, in the next year. And then this is, these are a few family photographs, my grandmother and grandfather with my oldest uncle Fritz. And then in the middle is my mother, as a toddler. And then on the far right, you see my mother as the youngest of 3 children. I feel like you can already see her determined expression having to deal with 2 older brothers. This photograph also was dated and was very helpful to me as a researcher. On the back, it's dated January 1938. So again, a very peaceful day. My mother dressed in sort of traditional Austrian style clothing for children. Looks like, it was taken at home. And you see really a very comfortable, well cared for child 2 months later, of course, everything ended. I referred to this spread in the passage that I read earlier, and this is it. When I found this, it really was so chilling to think that by then it was very apparent. This film, The Three Little Pigs, was the short film that was shown before Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And by then, everyone understood who the big bad wolf was. It was quite commonly understood. It took a while to get the passports returned after they were taken away following my grandfather's arrest. So in July 1939, they were able to get these passports. I remember seeing them when I was growing up. My mother kept them in her jewelry drawer, and but I never really opened them up because there was something so terrifying about them. But when I started researching, of course, I studied them very closely because these documents really helped me create a timeline for the story of how they escaped. And one of the things after you got a passport, of course, you needed to get a visa. And at that time, the quotas were terrible. They were never more than 40,000 from what was now the combined Austria and Germany. So of course, in no way did these quotas allow for what was a desperate need by then. This is the man who was very young at the time, about 30, the American who was posted in Vienna at the American consulate, who signed and issued and signed the visa. I became very interested in his family, in part because he was so different from my mother and her family. He was the son of a very wealthy family in New York City. And among many things that were fascinating about him is that he was also an avid mountain climber. And in fact, on the left, you see him as a very young man, probably during his days at Harvard University, on a climb with one of his friends. And then in the middle photograph, which I think may have been taken somewhere in the Catskill Mountains stateside, you see that this was a lifelong fascination for him. The mountain climbing connection became very important to me in putting the stories together. My mother, once they got the American visas, my mother and her parents went down by train to the city of Trieste, which really was a fascinating part of this research. I had not realized that Trieste had a very vibrant Jewish community, a very successful Jewish community. And they had, as some people might know, Trieste had at one point been part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. I made a trip to Trieste, and it's really remarkable to see how Austrian parts of the city still are. And the Jewish community looked after the immigrants who were passing through. They had hostels and places for the Jews to stay and be fed while they waited for their ships to depart. And of course, the great tragedy of the Jewish community of Trieste is that after the Italians surrendered in 1943, this very vibrant community was itself rounded up and deported. So I've spent quite a bit, I was very fortunate to be able to go to Trieste. There's a very beautiful Jewish museum there. And I'd encourage people to go look at their website. They have really beautiful exhibitions. Here is the ship that they sailed on. It was called the Saturnia. If you went first class, it was a luxury beyond belief. Of course, my mother and her parents traveled third class. They were lucky to get those tickets and lucky to be on that ship. This is a postcard that I was able to find of the ship passing through the Straits of Gibraltar. And then on the lower right, a photograph from about 1934 as the ship is entering New York City. But I'm sure it looked something like this in 1940 as well when they arrived. They had been able to ship a little bit ahead of time, some furniture they came with 2 small trunks. And these were some of the possessions that they chose to bring with them. My grandfather brought his compass and his camping tools, which are on the lower right, which I still have. And I just love looking at them. It was so moving to me that these were the items that were most precious to him, the memories of his days climbing in the mountains. On the lower left is a beautiful piece of 1920s Art Deco jewelry that my grandmother brought. And then on the upper right, a very small box, which I still have, and I still keep everything in there in its original box from Vienna of my mother's, some pieces that were my mother's jewelry. And this photograph, I think, is really the story of immigration in a way. You can see this family there at the Ford Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1940. They just arrived. To me, they look, as you would say, fresh off the boat. They still look very European to me. And they were lucky to be there. And in all the photographs that I have of them as new immigrants, they always stand like this, very close together. I think what they'd had to live through for 2 years under Nazi occupation might have torn some families apart, but in this case, it really brought them closer together. So to me, there's something about the contrast of this Ford Pavilion, so American, the future, and then this trio of new Americans. They became Americans very quickly. On the left is my mother, looking very glamorous, about 18, and she is visiting relatives who also had escaped, and they'd ended up in Florida. So the family, the sort of diaspora of the family, some people were in Detroit, some people went to North Carolina, some people ended up in Florida, and my mother stayed in New York. So in the middle is my father. So around this very same time, my father was fought in World War II. My father is still living. He's 96 now, and fortunately has an amazing memory and told me many stories about this time. But this was sort of, here he is in basic training. On the photograph on the far right, you can see my parents shortly after they met, and it was taken by a good friend of theirs. And then I'll close here with sort of a full circle photograph. My mother and my father both worked at Simon & Schuster Publishers for about 34 years. My mother started out as a graphic designer in the interior department and then concluded her career. She was vice president, took a lot of struggles to get to that level. So in the end, her father had worked in a paper and ink business, then she carried on. And in fact, I'm still in that business as well. And I'll close here and just mention that when the paperback comes out, I know that that's always very popular with book clubs. And I do very much enjoy visiting book clubs. And so if that's of interest, you can find me on Instagram. And thank you so much. So we'll conclude there. I will stop sharing. And then at this point, if people did have questions, this would be a good time to begin.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Julie. I have one, I don't know if it's a question or a statement on the chat. Marlene Colbert writes, Leopold Bellac is a psychiatrist in Larchmont for many years, spent a lot of time at the Freud's. He was friends with Freud's nephew, Ernst. I have one of the passports with a German eagle and a baby picture of me on it.
Yeah, so the passports, I don't show the full passport. In fact, that's just what they look like. They're sort of olive drab paper with the German eagle on the front. My mother is listed inside as the dependent, but there's actually no photograph of her inside the passport, which always, I've been quite curious about why there was no photo. But perhaps because it happened in such haste, and that might explain it.
Mm.
Yeah. But those passports were so useful to me because it created a timeline. I had all the dates then for when the passport was issued, when the visa was issued, so I could see how long it took them from the time of getting the passport to when they got the visa, and understand that during all that time, they were still living in their apartment in Vienna, under, of course, increasingly terrible circumstances with, of course, everyone was eating rationed food by then, but for Jews, it was even worse because their ability to shop and buy food and even be safe on the streets was, becoming riskier and riskier. My mother was still attending school until the, I guess, December of 1939. She saved her report card. So my mother, actually, I would say, my mother saved everything. And this turned out to be, of course, very helpful to me as the family historian.
All right, good. A few more questions. Did you, what happened to Eva's brothers in the midst of this?
So in the fall, well, right after March of 1938, in a way, one of the themes of the story was that they lived in an apartment building in an area of Vienna that was not, it was not the Jewish quarter. It's slightly, if you know Vienna at all, it's just outside the first ring. It's a very residential neighborhood. At that point, it wasn't especially Jewish. So in this apartment building, which wasn't very large, it was Jewish owned, but the family across the hall were Nazi sympathizers, and they made that very apparent immediately after the Anschluss happened on March 11th. And immediately they began threatening my mother's older brothers that because the young member of that family had already joined the Hitler Youth. And so the family felt that they had to get the two brothers out of Vienna immediately. And they had relatives in London, so they sent them away. And at that time, you could still, if you had money, you could send your children away claiming that they were going to boarding school. And that's what they did. So they sent them to live in London with another family that was cousins. This was very difficult. You can imagine my uncles were 14 and 17. The family never lived together again as a whole family. So this was devastating for the family. Of course, it saved their lives, but it was still, as you can imagine, a very difficult situation. My mother chose to stay behind, and this had always, I'd always wondered why she stayed behind and why her parents allowed her to stay behind when it would have been much safer, of course, for her to go with her older brothers. But as I know my mother, she was a very strong-willed person. And when I asked my father about it, he said, oh, that your mother was determined to stay with her parents and remain a companion. So she lived with them for 2 years of occupation.
So related to that, one of the questions we got, there's been a lot written about the impact of the Holocaust on survivors and their children. Could you comment on how your parents' experience as escapees impacted your family?
Yes, so in related to the question that was just asked, my two uncles ended up in England, and one of them eventually did come to live in the United States, but I'm sure this happened to many families where children were sent, sometimes children were sent away from their parents and never saw their parents again. I think what happened in this case was a fragmentation of the family, and it was very difficult for my mother, who was really the only companion for her parents. Once they got to New York, this was at a time when, it's not like they had immersion programs to help immigrants learn the language. My mother was sent to a public school right away, and it was very much a sink or swim situation. Meanwhile, my uncles were living with relatives in London. And by the time the war was over, the family would have ideally liked to reunite. But by this point, many years had passed. My uncles had become English, and one of them was already married. And so in a way, I think this is the legacy of the war, was that the family was quite torn apart. Everybody survived in this nuclear family, which was really fortunate, but they were never able to live as a family again. And I think the cost of that then passes down through generations. My mother, I think, had a lot of bitterness towards Austria. She had lost her childhood. She'd lost, her feeling of security and family. And then I think this does pass on to subsequent generations. There's been quite a lot of research done on the legacy of trauma, war trauma. And I think it's really something we see after every war, where there have been waves of immigrants coming, that it's really the continuing tragedy of the legacy of war.
Well, thanks. Maybe you were discussing it with Marty and I a little bit before we got started. Your successful pursuit of Austrian citizenship, and what that entails, and maybe your own feelings or insights about the process and the act of doing it.
Yes, it's I can also post later. I wrote a piece for sorry, there's a kind of a glare on the screen which wasn't there a while ago. I'm going to just see if I can get rid of it.
Sunny out.
Yeah, it got very bright. Okay, I think that might be better. Yes, thanks. So a few years ago, it was while I was doing the research, I started, my brother and I started exploring the possibility of being able to reclaim Austrian citizenship. At that time, the laws prevented us from doing so. They had been changed in the 1980s. There were so many rules and regulations, and both your parents had to be Austrian. There were many, I contacted a lawyer in Austria, and they told me they had tried and failed to help people in our situation to reclaim citizenship. But then, as I was explaining to Marty, a curious thing happened about 4 years ago, where a new chancellor came into Austria from the center conservative party, but he didn't win an outright majority, and he had to form a coalition government with a very far right party. I think it's called the OVP in the Austrian acronym. This party was actually founded by former Nazis in the 1950s. When this happened, the Jewish diaspora was up in arms, as you can imagine. And as a gesture, the Austrian chancellor said, "Oh no, we're not Nazis, and we're going to show you, and we're going to change the citizenship law." And so the irony is that then my brother and I were able to apply to reclaim Austrian citizenship in this way. It did take some years. So my brother and I just got our passports. But I would encourage any people who are of Austrian descent to look into this. It's difficult, it's time consuming. There are a lot of forms to fill out, but for me, it's been extremely important and gratifying to reclaim this. My brother and I are not even sure that what my mother would have thought of it. But at the same time, we feel that we've reclaimed it that it's a restitution, an act of reclamation and restitution. And, we did grow up in a home that was quite European. And for me, it makes me feel more complete, more whole.
Interesting. One of our group shares that she got her German citizenship back, and now her children and grandchildren are EU citizens. I guess that's worth pointing out that being a citizen of Austria, or any country in the Eurozone means that you're part of the European Union, and so have the ability to move around relatively freely, within
Indeed. Yeah.
pretty much Western Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a daughter who's 25 and she can apply. So they're accepting two generations after the person who was forced to leave. So yeah, to clarify, as I was explaining to Marty, that after 1938, after March 1938, all the Jews of Austria were stripped of citizenship. So they were really they were citizens of nowhere. So they had to somehow get themselves out of this country where they could not survive to somewhere else. But then they were kind of in this no man's land for quite some time until they could become citizens of their host country. So eventually as soon as my mother and her parents were able, they became American citizens. That was in 1947. So, and after that, my mother was American and a proud American citizen, as were her parents. But I don't know that she probably could have reclaimed Austrian citizenship after the war, but she didn't want to. The piece that I wrote for Tablet, which I'll post, and is about my effort to reclaim citizenship, but it's framed with a story about my mother, who in the 1990s wanted to get the pension that she would have been entitled to as an Austrian citizen. And she went to battle with the branch of the Austrian government that is in charge of the pensions. And you get a feel for my mother as a very determined person. It was a take no prisoners situation, but she got her pension. But it was, I think that sort of was, when I read through all those documents, which she also saved. She saved everything, even her handwritten drafts of letters to this bureaucrat in Vienna. It gave me a lot of insight into her personality, and also again made me question, why am I doing this? Why do I want this citizenship that she never would have wanted? But for me, it felt very necessary.
So thanks. Question related to citizenship, I guess. Have you gone back to Vienna, and what does it feel like? And is there any anti-Semitism, or did it manifest itself to you?
I've been to Vienna 3 times. The first was as a college student, so that was quite some time ago. When I started researching my book, I went back in 2012. And I would say that when I was there as a college student, you had the feeling the city felt a little stuffy, quite conservative. You didn't see a lot of, I guess, what I would call youth culture around. And it felt kind of a bit rigid there. By 2012, I had quite a different feeling about it. I still felt very other and very obviously Jewish when I would go there. I still felt quite an outsider. I went on my second research trip in 2019, fortunately, before the pandemic began. And by 2019, the difference was that I had already made connections to other historians and colleagues. And so I felt like it's not my city, but I don't feel like such an outsider. I feel like I could go back. I didn't yet have the Austrian passport, but the next time I travel there, which I do hope will be soon, I'll go as an Austrian citizen, and I'm sure it will feel very different to me. But it's a very beautiful city, and I think it's changing a lot. So you definitely see signs of a more integrated, city. There's a very small Jewish population. At the time that I went in 2012, it was estimated less than 10,000. In 1938, there were 200,000 Jews out of 2 million. So it was about 10% of the population. The Jews who live there now, I'm told, they are not related to the pre-war population, which of course people either fled if they could, or they were killed. The people who are living there now are often from Russia, so they're not connected to that pre-war population. But so this is why I feel that it is quite important for the descendants of the pre-war population to apply, because it's a bit of a restoration of that population from before the war.
Mhm. Interesting. So a question came in a little bit ago. How did your grandfather get out, given that he made an important product?
So that's this was one of the very few stories my mother would talk about. But the gist of it is that after the Anschluss, very, very quickly, so that happened in March, by July of 1938, the business had been taken away from him. So-called Aryanization was what they called it. It was done with an enormous amount of paperwork so that it was meant to look like a legitimate sale. But of course it was not, it was a theft. But because this factory produced quite complicated products, they kept my grandfather on to run the factory, because the new owner didn't really know how to operate the machines or keep things moving along. So they kept my grandfather there. They lived in the same building. So unlike many other Jews, by that point, they had a home. What happened in Vienna was that Jews were evicted from their own apartments, and then they would get moved into larger apartments where there would be, say, 4 or 5 families sharing an apartment. And my mother described to me that this was the case in their apartment. So what had been, the 2 brothers had been sent away by the fall, and then other families came to live in their apartment, other Jewish families. So they were confined by that point to just 2 rooms, but my grandfather was still running that factory. Then he got arrested in the fall of 1939. And there was this story that I recounted earlier about him being on the train for Dachau and then getting pulled off. So he got pulled off the train. He was ordered to go back and run this factory to make those paper fans. And then, of course, he didn't have a passport. The police had taken that away. So what he had to do, and of course, there's no one left. I had to use my imagination to some degree to imagine how he managed to persuade the authorities to return his passport to him and to even let him out, because in fact he was serving a useful purpose. So you had to somehow cajole, persuade, pay off, who knows? I think it was probably some combination of all those things that he got the passport back, and then you had to find some country that would take you. People went everywhere. They went to South America. There were relatives of my mother's family in Argentina. Unfortunately, I've never been able to locate them. People went to South Africa. People went to Shanghai. So, people were desperate to get somewhere. Getting an American passport was the lottery, was winning the lottery, was kind of an amazing thing. But they couldn't go to England because by the fall of 1939, we were at war. England was already at war, so they couldn't reunite the family that way. I'm sure that was their original plan, was to go live in London with their sons, but they couldn't get there.
So I have a question here. Someone writes, my nephew and his family live in Vienna. There is a small Reform synagogue. He says there is some anti-Semitism, but they love the city.
Yes, I didn't address that part in the previous question. Yes, I would say I wasn't ever there long enough to be able to determine if there was outright anti-Semitism, but what was clear was I just felt other, and I don't know any other way to describe it except that I didn't see any other people who looked Jewish to me, and you feel pretty different. It's if there was outright anti-Semitism, I didn't experience it firsthand, but I'm sure it's a very Catholic country and it's a very conservative country. And the fact of the matter is that in as recently as a few years ago, this far-right party was actually able to be part of the government. And it wasn't until after they became part of that coalition government, there was a huge scandal where perhaps, I mean, Americans, we don't really follow the Austrian, current events very closely, but there was a huge scandal where it turned out they still had these social clubs and they were singing Nazi songs at their social clubs. And then that's what forced the government to change. So now that center-right party had actually formed a coalition with the Green Party. So they went completely in the other direction. Vienna, though, I would say that while Austria is quite conservative, and it's maybe a situation where as a Jew, you wouldn't want to live outside Vienna. One might feel uncomfortable. I think in Vienna now, you walk around, it feels, there's a lot more immigrants there than the first time I went there. It feels more international and less like a museum, if that makes sense. It's a beautiful city. It's very beautiful.
Another question back to the family. Did the family ever seek compensation for the expropriation of your grandfather's business?
So they did. My cousin, one of my cousins who was an attorney, assisted with this. There was a tribunal at The Hague that officiated all of this, and they did receive some compensation for the loss of the business. Did it correspond to the actual loss? That is financially and emotionally, of course not, but it was some compensation once they received that. And then my mother fought and received a pension. You had to sign documents that would say that you weren't going to pursue any other legal means for getting restitution. I know that my mother told me that shortly after the war, so this would be in the late 40s, my grandfather tried to find out what had happened to his factory machinery and to try to reclaim that because of course it had value. And he was told, I believe a lie, he was told that it had all been sent to Germany and could not be located. I don't believe that because I've been to the factory that now makes those paper fans, and well, it's part of the story in the book, but that when I saw that machine, many things became clear to me. It's a very old machine. And the people who run that small factory told me they bought it in 1951 in Vienna. So, but I would say that this remained a source of bitterness and anguish really for my grandparents and then my mother for the rest of her life was the loss of everything, that they had had.
I think we're getting near the end of the questions. We have another one. The Jews of Berlin are invited back as guests. Is there anything like that in Vienna?
The law, it's the law that allowed me to reapply. It just went into effect in the fall of 2020. So it really is a new thing that, that this Jewish population is being invited back to participate. I know if you've ever read the book by Timothy Snyder, who writes about fascism, and it's a very beautiful, hard to read book, but very important, called Black Earth, that talks about the rise of fascism under Hitler and kind of what it has a different way of looking at it. But he gave a very beautiful talk, which you can find on YouTube, just about the warning signs and what we're seeing now. I feel that Austria is finally, after many, many decades of denying responsibility for their participation in the Holocaust, which they successfully did for a very long time, they are now having that reckoning. I think Germany, people in Germany that I know, Germans my age, they were taught in school that this was part of their schooling and they understood the legacy of it. And it remains very vivid in public life. People talk about it a lot. kids are learning about it in school. Austria, a little different. So I feel like they still have work to do, but I hope that there will be more effort in this regard.
Yeah. Okay. Lastly, someone shares, there was a Jewish underground that helped Jews collect documents and travel out of Europe. I have a great uncle who was part of that underground. We never learned how he himself got out and showed up one day in Israel.
So in fact, I'm very interested in this. I spent so much time researching this period, and I'm not done yet. I'm still very interested in it. And the project that I've started involves some of that. So if that person would like to reach out to me, I would really enjoy hearing more about that. I know that I've interviewed one person who was about 18 during this time period, managed to survive the entire war, living with his parents in the center of Vienna in an apartment. His neighbors did not turn him in, and he did have friends who were part of the underground and also part of the extensive black market, which was really the only way you could survive. You had to eat. And so this was really the underground economy. But I would very much be interested in hearing more about those forged documents, because that's something I'm researching now.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add my own. I was intrigued by a recent news article about Jews who lived in plain sight in Berlin, concealing their identity and using forged papers and basically not getting caught. Something like 1,500 of them, basically got through the war doing that. I wonder if there may have been a few like that in Vienna who might have persisted in that manner as well.
It was difficult. I
terrifying
think
existence.
Yeah, it was more difficult in Vienna in part because Vienna is a smaller city. So, people, if you can imagine, it's not tiny like a small town, but people knew each other. So Berlin being much larger, it would be easier to disappear if you could get fake papers.
Preserve anonymity.
Yeah. And if any of you have read Ariana Neumann's very beautiful memoir, When Time Stopped, that's what her father did. Her father got fake papers and left Prague and moved to Berlin and sort of disappeared. And he had light hair and was able to pass himself off as somebody, as a Czech citizen, but not Jewish. So, and in her memoir, she writes about how she didn't even realize she was Jewish until, after her father died, when she made the discovery of these family papers. I'm sure there were people who survived that way. And I know that that's how a lot of people got out, was with fake papers, to get over the border. One of the professors I worked with is Marian Kaplan at New York University. And she was very generous with her time. And she wrote it's a historical book, but incredibly moving, really, about how people escaped from Central Europe, all over Austria, Germany. And after a certain point, you could not get out legally. So the only way you could get out was overland, often with fake papers, through France, then going over the mountains into Spain, and then to Portugal. And they ended up in Lisbon. And there was a whole Jewish community in Lisbon of people waiting, trying to get on a ship. Some people didn't leave until 1950s. They waited all that time. Some people waited so long that they gave up, married Portuguese citizens, and lived in Portugal. So I think there are many, many amazing stories of escape, and I felt like I wasn't quite done yet, and so I'm still very fascinated by this period.
Okay. The very last question I have, did you know your grandparents?
No, I did not, and it's really one of the great sorrows of my life. I've heard a lot about them from my father, who did know them very well and really loved them. And in fact, when my parents were young and first married, they lived with my grandparents on the Upper West Side in their apartment together, which seems like a situation that, you know, might not be so common, but they really cared for each other. I'm very sorry I never met those grandparents. A lot of my research, in a way, was an attempt to get to know them and to imagine their lives.
Well, thank you. Lastly, I'll add there are signed books available at Anderson's Books. That's the hardback. And we will post this recording of today's talk on the Brotherhood website fairly soon. With that, I want to thank you, Julie, for sharing this incredible epic story with us, and thank everyone for all of your questions, comments, and insights that have come through.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.